This is Mae Brussell. It is tape number 856, May the 2nd, 1988. I'm not going into the details of the Iran-Contra affair because they're getting a lot of attention in the news. You know that Lawrence Welch, the primary investigator and judge, is holding up the case. His witnesses will not produce papers that are being held by the government, and he threatens to throw the whole case out, which would be very convenient after spending this time with the illusion that there's going to be some kind of an investigation into the secret team. But of course, Lawrence Walsh's law office in Oklahoma, you remember, was the same office that represented the Southern Air Transport Airline when it changed its name or functions from CIA to working for the National Security Agency with the gun running and the narcotics traffic. It was his law office that handled that. The Washington Post has a long article, April 20th, on the chief counsel selected by Lawrence Stern to carry on with the suit if it takes place. His name is Herbert J. Stern. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, and he was made a judge by crook President Richard Nixon, who appointed him to be a federal judge. He stepped down from the judgeship last year and is coming in to help Lawrence Walsh. His background is that he was born in New York, grew up in Manhattan, and as a young person, assistant under District Attorney Frank Hogan, Hogan, he was assigned to the Homicide Bureau, where he directed the grand jury investigation into the murder of Malcolm X. So I don't have to tell you, researchers are interested people anymore. The likes of this Herbert Stern, the one appointed as a judge by Richard Nixon, because the investigation of the Malcolm X case was a complete fraud. It was an outright murder, political assassination, and once more they're bringing in the young ilks of the Leon Jaworskis. So Stern will help Lawrence Walsh, and I can imagine what kind of prosecution these guys will put on. I'm not going into a subject that is taking place in the news now. I want to call attention to it and do a lot more as soon as I get finished with the article in Barron's that I started last week that's so important. But there are a whole series of deaths that are taking place that I'm going to update for you. And one has to do with corporations. There's a long article in Wall Street Journal about companies being prepared to deal with the sudden death of chief executives. And it goes, of course, into the case of Mr. James Olson, who died of cancer. And quickly the head of the AT&T was taken over by another person, Robert Allen, a graduate of Harvard Business School who was groomed for this spot a long time ago, and he just slid into place one day before their annual meeting. The chief investigator of Chernobyl died, 51 years old, 2-year anniversary since the Chernobyl explosion. Of course, I believe and have put on the air right from the beginning or shortly after that I thought it was sabotage by persons to embarrass and cause pain to the Soviet Union, and I'll update more on that later. And I do want to go into the death of not only the British scientists who are disappearing, there's 10 so far, and I can't ignore just mentioning the mystery of the 10 scientists, it's up to that many, but in Japan, the heads of Japanese corporations that are dying, and I haven't been able to have time to put that on the air, and I'll do that very soon. That is a very big story, what is happening in Japan, and the parallels took place between World War I and World War II when the heads of states, political people in Germany and in Japan were being systematically wiped out. There was a story going back a year ago, July 24th, 1987. Japanese are losing their top executives. They are killed in action on the economic front, dying of various diseases, and when described as killed in action, it means while fighting their company's war against the rapid rise of the yen and resulting economic shifts, there were a large number of about 10 officials of the Japanese government, and I want to go into the death squads in Japan. Somebody sent me some material from a book on Japan, and I know that Ryoshi Sasakawa and his ilk were responsible for those before Pearl Harbor, and of course in Germany they were systematically killing politicians until Hitler was officially in power, and one top executive of Japan, 42 years old, died this week. So I want to update those with you. Peter Drucker, the person from Frankfurt, Germany, the father of our multinational businesses, who wrote the script for what is described in the movie Network, making corporations larger than countries. Peter Drucker is going to be in San Francisco May 13th. There's an ad in the San Francisco Examiner for people on the West Coast. You might call. I don't know what it's going to cost. Toll-free number 800-424-9773. Toll-free. The Great Day with Peter Drucker in San Francisco. These people are old. He brought the great Fritz Kraemer to the United States. He was responsible for that. They grew up in the same town in Germany. Then Fritz Kraemer recruited Henry Kissinger, and they're still going, the Sven Kramer, the next generation, going the great old master Peter Drucker, the ilk of Hermann Apps of the I.G. Farben and the Deutsche Bank and John J. McCloy and the Chase Manhattan Bank. These old-timers live to be old, and he will be in San Francisco. You can have a day with Peter F. Drucker. And in San Francisco, this past Saturday, April the 30th, there was a holistic fair for the New Age people, and one of the guest speakers was Trevor Ravenscroft, who wrote The Spear of Destiny. I couldn't get to San Francisco this weekend. It was too short notice, and I had other plans, but San Francisco is the home base of the Church of Satan, of Anton LaVey, and the Church of Set of Michael Aquino, and Mr. Trevor Ravenscroft, who wrote The Spear of Destiny, and the importance of that to the occult and to Heinrich Himmler and to Germany, was the guest at the Whole Age Fair in San Francisco. So these people are indeed floating around. Also on television, a subscriber, long friend and world watcher, told me that on Saturday nights, following West 57th Street, 11 o'clock, CBS, there's a program called Friday the 13th. And I watched it last night. I don't like horror movies, but the movie, if you wait to the end or watch the last 10 minutes of the end, the person writing the movie is none other than William Taub, the great William Taub. I did many broadcasts on Taub. He is part of the Gulf and Western company that produced this series. They produced many, and he gets credit for writing the series. I mentioned William Taub in my article in Rebel on the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. Page 24, you can find the references to William Taub, who housed the Vatican chief of intelligence and spying in his home in New York during the war, and then he went back to the Vatican, Father Felix Morlion. And William Taub wrote in his book, The Forces of Power, how it was none other than Ernest Keiser who tried to murder him when he was thrown off a road in Switzerland, believed to be dead. Ernest Keiser is the one who brought Edwin Wilson to the officials in Dominican Republic, and then he was arrested and brought in to the United States. Ernest Keiser is Ernest von Keiser of the Wehrmacht, who works for the United States government, the Internal Revenue Service, the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, who was offering a judge down in Miami to get him off of a case and high penalties, and in return he would bring in Joseph Mengele. And at that point, Taub was shot in Washington carrying papers about Robert Vesco, and he fled to Europe, and he was one of the catalysts that started the story that Mengele was officially dead, because he was going to bring him in and knew there'd be a big bounty for that. So Taub has been closely associated, unfortunately, with the likes of Keiser and the negative force, and he also was a wheeler and dealer of extraordinary talent and reach, if you can get the book Forces of Power. So he's producing that movie, and this is another one of those old-timers that appears again on the scene. In These Times had a short story about Henry Kissinger, March 30th, 1988, titled Germans Honor War Criminal. And this is what it says. A couple of weeks ago, police searched private houses in Nuremberg, West Germany, and nearby Erlanger in an effort to find and confiscate any anti-Kissinger banners, stickers, and leaflets. These actions paved the way for Henry Kissinger, March 19th, to accept an honorary doctorate degree from Friedrich Alexander University in Erlanger. Diana Johnstone of In These Times reports that officials also brought in, because Kissinger was going to be there, a massive police force to hold back people who were protesting the honoring of the famous American real politiker as a so-called humanist historian in quotes, the European tradition of thought. And he does fit into that German tradition of thought, if you can generalize it. And I'm thinking of the worst part, not the best part. The article said university sources told the newspaper that the idea of honoring Kissinger originated with Professor Michael Sturmer, a speechwriter and advisor to Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who in 1986 set up the so-called Historians Debate About Nazi Germany's Past. The gist of the debate that he set up was that Nazi crimes were not unique and unprecedented, so therefore not so bad, but rather a response to the Bolshevik threat. University sources said Sturmer pulled strings to get Kissinger this honorary degree. The story goes that several years ago at Harvard University, the two men cut a deal. Sturmer was seeking a post in Washington. He wanted Kissinger to put in a word for him, and even though Sturmer's career changed course, Kissinger wanted his degree, so they were going through the town trying to find out who was putting up the signs against Henry Kissinger. And this past weekend, there was an article in our Monterey Herald, which I actually missed. The title was about Jordan being the kingdom to the Middle East peace. Any world watcher told me to get the Herald out and reread it again, because the speaker was Clinton Bailey, and he was speaking in here at Monterey and was talking about the problems of Middle East history. And he said there have been excesses in crackdowns against the Arabs, Bailey said. But it is a very difficult line to hold, and there are people who have lost their patience. He told the audience that some international figures, including Henry Kissinger, have counseled the Israelis to use, in quotes, massive force to put down the uprisings by shooting large numbers of people. And of course, Kissinger added, take the cameras away so the media won't see it. Now, there's a long, large article. If you hear the paper rattling, it's the size of a whole sheet of paper. New York Times. It isn't an article, rather, it's a paid ad. Monday, April 18th, 1988. And I am going to give you the main points of this ad and remind you that through the whole weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, whatever television or news I saw, there wasn't hardly a mention of this subject. The ad was paid for by the Nuclear Control Institute, and I'll put the address on the sheet, so if you want to write to them, you can. Warning, in big black letters 2 inches high, we are about to provide Japan more deadly plutonium than the United States and Russia have in all their nuclear weapons combined. We are putting the world at risk. Only Congress can stop it, and only until April's end. Plutonium, named for the god of hell, forms atom bombs, triggers hydrogen bombs. 15 pounds of it in the hands of a terrorist group or nation could make an atom bomb like that destroyed Nagasaki. Now the United States has acceded to Japanese pressure and has agreed to provide Japan with at least 150 metric tons of plutonium. In its 24,000 nuclear weapons, the United States has only 100 metric tons. Over 30 years, the Japanese can acquire 400 metric tons of plutonium, twice the United States and Soviet nuclear arsenals combined. Japan's nuclear energy plants run on uranium fuel supplied and controlled by the United States. This fuel is unsuitable for bombs. The nuclear process power, however, produces plutonium, locked away in spent fuel. Japan, without energy sources of its own, has demanded bomb-grade plutonium as fuel for its plants. The irony is that the United States, by regulation, forbids American nuclear power plants to use plutonium, but Japan wants it. And the U.S. has supplied nuclear fuel enough to start a commercial plutonium industry. The reasons to stop this are compelling. Number one, you should be concerned that pure plutonium can be used by terrorists or nations to be made into weapons, and the United States believes that security risks outweigh any economic benefit. 2, plutonium makes no economic sense compared to cheap, plentiful uranium. 3, plutonium is the deadliest of toxins. A microscopic speck of plutonium powder in nuclear fuel, if inhaled, kills. The United States has the contractual right to control Japan's use of plutonium on a case-by-case basis until 2003, and that isn't very long from now. But under Japanese pressure, spurred by nuclear lobbies, the Reagan administration has now abdicated any legal safeguards for responsibility, and we agreed to Japan carte blanche commercial use of U.S. supplied plutonium for the next 30 years. Caspar Weinberger says no. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission says no. They urged Reagan to say no. They said the agreement has weak safeguards and security measures. The agreement violates requirements of law designed to protect U.S. security interests. The Pentagon warned in a separate report to Congress that opportunities for terrorist acts, including attempts to steal it for civilian plutonium, will increase substantially. The guards at the Japanese plants, even the nuclear plants with plutonium, carry no guns. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission warns that every year hundreds of pounds of plutonium will be unaccounted for in Japanese nuclear plants. Inspectors will not know if plutonium sufficient for dozens of bombs yearly is lost in the pipes or stolen. A study by 5 former Los Alamos designers of weapons conclude that terrorists could turn 15 pounds of stolen plutonium into a bomb and yield in excess of 1,000 tons of TNT. That 2 tons destroyed the Marine barracks where 241 Marines were killed in Beirut. Now, part of the scenario for disaster lies in transporting the plutonium to Japan. Japan has a 30-year approval to fly it from France and Britain to Japan over the polar route. The catch is that no one has devised a crash-proof cask to contain large quantities of toxic plutonium powder, 300 pounds per flight, 3 flights a month for 3 decades without accident, piracy, sabotage, or threat. Good luck. The Senate succumbs. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted 15-3 to reject the agreement. Majority Leader Byrd and Minority Leader Dole introduced a resolution of disapproval. Representative Solarz, the Asian Affairs Subcommittee, began negotiations with the State Department to strengthen these controls. Yet on March 21st, the Senate succumbed to a nuclear industry and the administration and to Japanese economic reprisals. They have us controlled to economically blackmail us if we don't give them what they want, and now what they want is enough plutonium that could destroy us. This full-page ad for New York Times, April 18th, 1988, has a request that you write or call various members of Congress, but it is the President of the United States, and of course, behind this hand is Henry Kissinger of Kissinger Associates, who's close to Japan, David Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission, and Sven Kraemer or Fritz Kraemer and the members of the Trilateral Commission that want Japan and Germany to have all the breaks. America will be polluted, bankrupt, and someday that plutonium will be sent to us. And just as China is sending weapons to Saudi Arabia to destroy Israel, Japan can spread this plutonium, and there will be no safeguards or ways to watch it. We are really and truly getting into a disaster state, and this is a very important piece of information that was given no attention on the weekend. Now, some attention was given to FBI reports in Ollie North. Most of you have seen these through the wire services, I believe. There was a long story in the San Francisco Examiner. FBI papers suggest North used the agency, the gist being that Ollie North wanted to get back at the Christic Institute when they were filing their suit, and the Christic Institute had caught on to the secret team and the people that worked with the National Security Council. So North told the FBI agents that his tires were slashed, that he was being followed, that his dog was poisoned, and hinted it was coming from the people in the Christic Institute who were filing a suit against him, that there was harassment. And in the process of the FBI investigating these matters, they came across clear evidence that Ollie North, in fact, was involved with weapons down to the Contras, and they even got a whiff of the drug traffic, the possibility of the drug traffic, and that the dog was not poisoned. The dog died of a cancer, and the cut tires and so forth were a lie. So what he was trying to do is to use the federal agencies to protect his ass, and it boomeranged because the federal agencies, although they didn't stop what he was doing and report it to Congress when Robert McFarlane was lying to Congress and Elliot Abrams, the FBI kept all that quiet. Mr. William Webster, who's now CIA director, but they said that they would not follow through and harass the people that North wanted harassed, because they found out that he was lying and that those things indeed were not happening. And the gist of these articles is how far Ollie North will go to stop the people who are after him and use the federal government to do it. Now, Wall Street Journal had a long article, April 27th, just after last week's tape, titled Close Reagan Advisors Mount a Drive to Force the Attorney General Out. And this matter was even covered on Sunday morning. They left out a lot of the material and some of the more obvious. The major media still isn't touching this story. But the gist of this long Wall Street Journal article is that when the report comes in of Mr. McKay, the special prosecutor, there won't be a prosecution of Meese, but that the people around Ronald Reagan are urging him to get out. And the interesting aspects of this article, because we know so much about Meese, or should know if you follow it, there were three things. One, former Defense Chief Weinberger got involved after last month's resignation of Justice Department officials, and he telephoned Chief of Staff Baker to say Meese must go. Now, Weinberger is part of this secret military computer operation that the Justice Department is using that I mentioned last week, and I'll continue with the entire side of this tape called INSLAW. But he doesn't want this thing to unfold publicly anymore, and he probably feels getting Meese out would help take some of the heat off that suit, the settlement, and the matters going. And Weinberger has a lot to stop this investigation from going on and on, because once Meese is out, for all purposes, the investigative work is stopped, just as when Paul Laxalt stepped out of office, now the Senate. He didn't run for president, so people stopped looking into his mafia connections. And when Raymond Donovan stepped down as the Secretary of Labor and his case was off, he was acquitted of charges. He still, and everybody knows, must be itchy or antsy about three primary witnesses that were murdered in the course of the trial. So we don't hear a word about him. But the news is quiet. Donovan isn't news. And also, this Wall Street Journal article said that Mr. Spencer, the long friend of the Reagans, who managed Reagan's gubernatorial campaign, visited President and Mrs. Reagan in the White House quarters and warned that Meese is a political problem. Spencer is the man that Reagan, or Mrs. Nancy Reagan, talks to every day. He was the one who sent the president to a mind control center for programming in the very beginning and tries to keep his head straight so he doesn't make too many boo-boos. And Spencer's nervous about Meese staying on, because the real story about Meese that's in the article published in Barron's is that it goes back to the early California days, and the people involved in California were Dr. Bryan and Lowell Jensen and the group around Mr. Spencer that he was programming, and Caspar Weinberger. They all worked together, Dr. Earl Bryan and Weinberger and so forth. So they're a little bit nervous that the private investigators are getting on this case, and particularly the front page of Barron's. And then there was another quotation in the Wall Street Journal: the Reagan's California cabinet, the ones that put him into power in the beginning, will follow through on their own private concerns and take a more active role in the scenario. Well, I believe the key point of this is that Mr. Spencer and the kitchen cabinet, Caspar Weinberger, say, get out already, get out, because, as I say, there will be good investigative reporting, and eventually these stories, in the course of years to come, will go right back to California, to these people. The best book on those links in California crooks and Reagan, their fascism, their dirty tricks, is the one that Don Freed wrote about Ronald Reagan, which Hustler magazine bought, can't be distributed, and it was tied up when Rebel collapsed and Larry Flint was taken to the funny farm. The book was tied up. That was the best book, and maybe if it isn't published, we'll have to make printed copies and sell them and just get them out to people, because that goes back to the early California days. So the kitchen cabinet, Weinberger and Spencer, are saying, Reagan, come on, get him out. And of course, Reagan denies that all these people are pressuring them, but it would be very hard for Wall Street Journal to write an article like that with so many details if these things weren't in fact happening. I went back into my files this week for some material backtracking this case of the computer and the Justice Department INSLAW, and pulled out a long article about D. Lowell Jensen when Reagan made him a district court judge in San Francisco. The Chronicle had a story October 13th, 1986. A year and a half ago, the former number 2 official in the Justice Department has been accused in a $30 million lawsuit of helping to force the computer company into bankruptcy court. His accuser is William Hamilton, president of Washington-based INSLAW, developer of a sophisticated computer system called Promise. that was purposely, and this article goes in, purposely destroyed by those people in the Justice Department, and it quotes the judge as saying how the Justice Department tried to bankrupt this company, and how D. Lowell Jensen, when he was in California, had his own computer system. Early in 1974, right after Reagan was through being governor, he wanted to sell this computer system throughout California, and it didn't sell in Los Angeles. The district attorney there, the county district attorney, turned it down, and the state district attorney's office turned it down, and that Lowell Jensen was part of the destruction of this company going into bankruptcy because he was competing with it. And it quotes Judge George Basin, the man I mentioned last week, presiding over the case, who said there was a personal vendetta of the very people that wanted to sell their company, and therefore they were determined to bankrupt their competitor. So this article was in 1986, and I have other files on this, but to bring it up to date, I want to go into that current article that was in Barron's and continue with that and share that with you because, as I said last week, it's so terribly important. Last week I did part one of an article from Barron's National Business Financial Weekly that a friend sent me from San Francisco who takes Barron's regularly, called Road Justice, Who and What Were Behind the Vendetta Against INSLAW, INSLAW, by Maggie Mahar, M-A-H-A-R. And I brought up the fact that a small software company, INSLAW, was owned by a man named Bill Hamilton, and he sold a part of the program PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S, those are the initials for Prosecutors Management Information System. He sold that to the Justice Department for $10 million, and then after he made the sale, everything went bad. That Judge George Basin, a man who sat in on the hearings of the liquidation of this company and the bankruptcy, had said that the Justice Department was trying to steal the software of PROMIS through trickery, fraud, and deceit, that the Justice Department agents themselves were the crooks of trickery, fraud, and deceit, and that the man who was sabotaging the system, one of the men was a man named Brewer, his middle name is Brick, C. Madison Brick Brewer, who wanted his company sold to the Justice Department earlier, and worked with not only his company, it was Lowell Jensen who had the company, but Brick Brewer was working with Mr. Hamilton in his company when he was fired, and went on to the Justice Department, and I guess determined, knowing probably that it was a good system, that the Justice Department would need it, could buy it, and then he would own it someday, being in the Justice Department, and he could get even with Mr. Hamilton, who fired him. And Lowell Jensen was in on sabotaging this and has been named in a suit because it was his company on the side that he wanted to sell to the Justice Department. I mentioned last week the whistleblower on this case, Tony Pasuto, was fired after 21 years in the Justice Department, and broke down certain aspects of the implications. And I want to go more now with you into this case, INSLAW, that has so many ramifications. And of course, one of the most frightening that I mentioned last week was the fact that 50 to 60 career employees or more have been fired from the Justice Department and replaced by political appointees who got a GS, which is government service, and you can't tell that they're political appointees. They're changing the paperwork on that, and that the FBI computers have been used under Mr. William Webster, who did some very terrible things. He comes in so sanitized as the great William Webster to be director of the CIA. The William Webster allowed FBI background checks, to manufacture a reason to have somebody be forced to leave their job so the political appointees called moles could be put into their place. And I said the moles were timed exactly 18 months ago to the time, again, when Danny Sheehan of the Christic Institute was filing his suit on the secret team. And, of course, that litigation would be taking place for years, and the Justice Department probably knew that he could easily win based upon the amount of evidence he was accumulating, and therefore there would be appeals and stalling cases and holding up the evidence and, all kinds of trickery of the Justice Department to put pressure on those people in Miami that are conducting the case, because all of them have political ambitions to be attorney generals and work up to Washington and so forth, so that the Washington offices of the FBI and the Justice Department can put pressure on their employees down in Miami, and the placement of moles is a very dangerous situation. And that's where I left off last week, with the threat of years and years to come of political appointments that appear to be longtime justice people, separate from the policies of Reagan and Bush and Carter, et cetera, who probably handpicked, again, through the screening of their computers, to carry the trickery of this very agency to the nth degree and throw out cases that should be tried, of course, and let off cases that should be convicted. And they will be very good at doing that. We'll take a 1 second now and do the other side of the tape and do some more on this horrible case and the implications of it. This is tape number 856, side 2, May 2nd, 1988, and I'm talking about the article in Barron's, part 2, Rogue Justice, Who and What Were Behind Vendetta Against INSLAW. Now, the quotations of the article are very powerful, and of course I always go off the record and add my interpretation to them, and I'll share some of the material that this author put in there, of course, with her words. And she says that the resignations that took place March the 30th, and there's been more since then, there's 10 that have resigned from the Justice Department, and the report of the special prosecutor that will be out very shortly, John McKay, will come closer to addressing the real question: what was there at the Justice Department, what was happening at the Justice Department during the past 4 years? And of course, 4 years ago was when I was describing the disaster of Edwin Meese and Ursula Meese and the gang around them from California. She said the INSLAW case is virtually an unpublicized window on how the Justice Department did their business during the Meese years. And the article I cited from the Examiner, that long article, is just one of very, very few. Even though this lawsuit's been pending for several years, she said it is an unpublicized window, which is a tragedy because this is the one department that shouldn't be protected from what it's doing. She said Judge George Basin made charges that the department committed, and quote again, I had them before, a willful and wanton and deceitful act, a series of acts demonstrating contempt both for law and for any principle of fair dealing. That's the Justice Department's contempt for the law. And she said Bill Hamilton, the founder of INSLAW, when he had his problems, believed that he only had one problem. He believed that C. Madison Brewer, the man that he fired earlier, was the cause for his problems in the Justice Department. But when he went to court, he realized it wasn't just Brewer that was doing this to him. That would be easy when he went to the court, June 9th, 1986. But when his trial progressed, the trial on the bankruptcy and so forth, he then began to see that Brewer wasn't solely responsible, that it was a policy, not of a man that he had fired who had a vendetta, which is easy enough to handle, but it was the policy of the entire Justice Department and the team under him. And then the question is asked in the article, why did the Justice Department put Brewer, a man fired by Hamilton, into the critical position, which is highly improper, and allow him to remain? He had been fired by Hamilton way back in 76. What was he doing handling the contract later with a man he absolutely hated? And the judge was surprised at how much hatred he had against him. And the author of this article said, why did the Justice Department refuse to settle the case? As it opened up and the scandal went on, they refused to settle it. They kept going. And why were the government lawyers? They weren't just satisfying in bankrupting INSLAW. It's a company that they originally agreed to have the program, and the program was good enough to buy. Why did they press to liquidate it, which is a totally different story than bankruptcy? The Hamiltons won their case by the end of 1987, but they still wanted to know what happened and why their company was in near ruin. And the interest was in the Justice Department, and he couldn't believe that they had selected people to wipe him out and take away his company. A comparison can be made in the publishing business or research business, where they buy up a book, a good book, just as you buy up a computer company. Then the owner of the book doesn't advertise it or let you know it's available, and he throws it on the remainder table, and it's not seen, and it's sold out for $1 or $2, and people who would want it don't see it. And so they are purchased to be destroyed, and his system was purchased. And the man, in this case, the man was to be destroyed, and then the company would go in the hands of people who were ready and competing with him earlier to receive the losses. And again, this book that Don Freed wrote, The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan, was bought by Hutzler, and then it was never allowed to be seen. And in there were remarks, a page about Charles Willoughby. His real name is Wiedenbach, Karl Wiedenbach, from Hitler's Kriegsacademy, and how he was meeting with Dr. Loyal Davis. Dr. Loyal Davis was a neurosurgeon, Nancy's father, and Dr. Earl Bryan, a listener, a friend, told me, reminded me, was a neurosurgeon, and I wonder if Dr. Earl Bryan, who worked for Ronald Reagan in the health and welfare in California and then made tremendous profits out of contacts with him, had anything in common or knew Nancy Davis's father, the neurosurgeon. Now, Elliot Richardson is quoted in this article as being one of the attorneys who represented Hamilton to save his case. Richardson has been on television blasting Edwin Meese in the last few weeks. He said he should go. Richardson is also the attorney for the late Cyrus Hashemi, and he was involved, Hashemi, with meetings with Hakim and Secord and sending arms to Iran. And Elliot Richardson feels that even being part of the team, he was part of that Saturday Night Massacre when they left office, when Richard Nixon was creating the scandal in the Justice Department at the time of Watergate, and he started to represent Mr. Hamilton. But when Hamilton was working with the law office that Richardson came from, there were problems even in that law office. So the Hamilton started listing all the anomalies and tried to figure out what the mystery was. And they tried to organize all the things they saw until, according to this story, when you put them side by side, the story then fit together differently than just being knocked down with one surprise after the other as the company was hit. Just like the Titanic hitting an iceberg, a successful company was falling apart. And the conclusion that I mentioned was that the massive cover-up was not just to protect Brick Brewer, but someone had persuaded Judge Blackshear, one of the judges in this case, to recant his testimony under oath within 48 hours of his original deposition. And the question was asked in this article, has the power to make a judge change his testimony in 48 hours from what he said before that? And according to this author, you don't do that to a federal judge. The Justice Department shouldn't be doing that to a federal judge, not to protect just Mr. Brick Brewer, who didn't like Hamilton. It has to be bigger than that. And then there was criminal liability at the highest level of the department. So Bill Hamilton thought about the matter and went back to what he said were early warnings about the Justice Department methods. Now, what he says here, and I'll recount that, a letter was sent to the editor of Barron's, and when I'm through this article, I'll share that with you next week and show you the fallacies or holes in it. So I'm not going to repeat what was printed in the letters of the editor. I'm just going to tell you what was in this article. Mr. Hamilton said that as he looked back chronologically to what happened to him after he sold his company in 1982, that he got a telephone call in April of 1983, and he didn't take it seriously. But it was a call from a man named Dominic Laiti, L-A-I-T-I, who's chairman of HADRON Incorporated, HADRON Corporation. And on tapes 639, 641, 642, I'll get into them later, March of 1984, 4 years ago, I was doing a broadcast on HADRON Corporation and Dr. Earl Bryan and the links to Ursula and Edwin Meese. But the chairman of HADRON Corporation called the president, Mr. Hamilton, of his company and INSLAW, and said, do you want to sell your company? And at that time, this was just the time of the hearings on Edwin Meese for Attorney General, and Hadron's name had come up, and Dr. Earl Bryan's name had come up, and so forth. So he said, no, I'm not interested in selling it. I'm satisfied. And Mr. Laiti identified himself, and he said Hadron intended to become the leading vendor providing software for the law enforcement nationwide, that it intended to become the leading vendor, and would you like to sell to us? Now, this was really scary, and Meese had direct links to Hadron. Hadron and Meese were involved with things in California such as the Garden Plot, the Federal Emergency Management, the California Justice System, the military police, Squad 19, the LA Police Department. Meese was tied up to all the police computers of the military intelligence, the reserves, the Army reserves and so forth, and the plot for emergency takeover of the country. And his friend from HADRON, the chairman, was saying that they were going to be the leading vendor for law enforcement nationwide. And Mr. Laiti claimed that he had purchased Simcon, S-I-M-C-O-M, that was a police department software, and he also had purchased Acumetics, and this is important, Acumetics, a company that provides computer-based litigation support services for the courts. Now, HADRON said, we want to buy INSLAW, your system, and INSLAW had gotten the contract already with the Justice Department, and HADRON was represented by Meese's friends and wanted to own it. And Mr. Hamilton told Mr. Laiti, the chairman, that his ambition so far to be the major vendor of the software services, that he had the same ambition, and he said, we're not interested. And Laiti, according to Hamilton, kept pushing and boasting and said, we have very good political contacts in the current administration. We can get this kind of business. Now, Attorney General William French Smith was just ready to leave the Justice Department in 1983 and make room for Edwin Meese to go in. Smith's law office represents the Los Angeles Police Department, the same police department that was feeding the computers of Western Goals that transferred from California, where they had a branch office, and I'm sure they still have Western Goals out there, right to Carl Spitz Channel as soon as Larry McDonald was killed on the KAL. And Meese knew, of course, and Ollie North knew, and these people knew, that the California Western Goals was being fed from the Los Angeles Police Department, and the attorney for the Los Angeles Police Department was the same man who was the attorney for President Ronald Reagan, William French Smith, and Reagan had made him the Attorney General, so that the ties to Dr. Bryan and health, education, and welfare in California with Ronald Reagan and the LAPD files that were into those computers were, of course, important to the future police states, and for getting biographies of people to get out of jobs, such as the Justice Department, to put moles in. So there was a lot of pressure here, because this man wanted to control these computers, probably here and elsewhere, but the story involves this particular company. So Bill Hamilton, when he signed his contract, he said, we're not interested in selling. And Dominic Laiti answered, according to Hamilton, we have ways of making you sell. Well, the other way of making you sell is not really to sell it, but to liquidate it and then receive it at the other end after you completely sabotage it. So a member of the Senate staff who's now involved in investigating the Justice Department said, I would think that the whole tale was a fantasy if I hadn't been involved in investigating the Iran-Contra affair, but now he's investigating the software contracts because he knows that there are no more fantasies after reading about these secret teams and the methods they have to operate and take over. Now, Hamilton said he remembered the call and he shrugged it off, and the chairman of HADRON was so aggressive that he didn't think anything about it, but he kept it in the back of his mind when everything came apart how bad it was. And from behind the scenes, the man who controlled HADRON was none other than Dr. Earl Bryan, a Meese crony from California days, and Rick Brewer, the project manager who was bitter about being fired, was working also with Earl Bryan and D. Lowell Jensen, then Deputy Attorney General, now a federal judge appointed by Reagan. This article says, a ghost from INSLAW's own California past had developed a software product to compete with INSLAW, and he lost it in 1970 in Alameda County, and that's Lowell Jensen, and I read some of a newspaper article about his background. And when Reagan became president, he appointed Jensen from Alameda County to be a top-ranked member of the Justice Department right under Edwin Meese. And when Bill Hamilton sat down in good faith and signed a deal to negotiate with the Justice Department, the people on the other side of the table were not, according to this author, dispassionate government officials. They were a hostile crew, inspired apparently by old scores to get even, one being fired, and with private business interests that wanted to buy his company or compete with it, couldn't buy it, and also they had an alternate system that wasn't sold to the Justice Department. So the game plan was get the best computer system you can find, sign and contract and buy it, offer to buy it from them. If they don't sell it, make them liquidate. Bankruptcy is not enough. Take the system for yourself. And the people that were being used for this were Ronald Reagan's Edwin Meese, the Attorney General, Mr. Jensen from California, The people that had worked with the Los Angeles Police Department, with Otto von Bolschwing, with Reinhard Gehlen, and the dirty tricksters that wanted to have their hand, indeed, in control of the police files. Not only, I'm sure, this isn't just for the state of California, but for the entire nation. This article in Barron's continues, the attack was successful for a while as the cover-up spread out to embrace the Justice Department, the IRS, the Attorney General Arnold Burns, the Deputy Attorney General Arnold Burns, the one that retired just March 30th, and he had become Lowell Jensen's successor, and they did what they called to circle the wagon. And again, the shocking thing about this story is that we're not talking, well, we are talking about organized crime and the mafia. As Martha Mitchell said, the mafia is in the White House. For that statement, she got a needle in her ass and a cancer that caused her death within a few years. But the technique is the very brutal technique of the mafia that have worked their way up, indeed, into the Justice Department, and the term is circled the wagon. And the Justice Department became the offensive person against this Mr. Hamilton, not defending his rights, but offensive, as described in Barron's Financial Weekly. They used their attorneys, a special attorney, the Justice Department whistleblower was destroyed, a member of a prestigious law firm was destroyed, one judge lost his job, another was forced to perjure under testimony, sworn testimony, and so forth, and the place became so corrupt. And this is what some people are saying, the Justice Department really can't function like this too much longer in this way. Now, Bill Hamilton was lucky, this is saying lucky, in that when the company was to be liquidated, the great taker was IBM, and they became INSLAW's savior to save his company from the auction block. Just several weeks ago on tape number 854, April 18th, I quoted some references of Paddy Chayefsky's story Network in the lines, there is no America, there is no democracy, there is only IBM, ITT, AT&T, and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. These are your nations of the world. Well, since I had that quote on the air, the president of AT&T died of a 3-week cancer just one day before the annual board meeting, a very political situation that he had there. And this company several years ago was taken over by that other country, IBM, the company of Bill Hamilton. So in come the greedy arms of these corporations, and the word is rescued his company, but for all purposes, it belongs to IBM. So IBM came one of these nation buyers and took up the INSLAW contract. It wasn't a complete loss, but again, it gets swallowed to the major companies. Now, the Senate staffers looked into INSLAW, and they thought it raised a question about something called Project Eagle. And this is what I'm wondering is really dangerous, and the article gets back to Eagle later. They said that is a much larger scheme to computerize the Justice Department. This $200 million contract will be awarded at the end of 1988, and they're afraid that this is taking his company was to add it to Eagle. And Eagle possibly could be one of these major plans of the worldwide Odessa in the process of controlling the world, and it could tap into those major computer companies, 6 or 8 of them, down in Austin, Texas, that Bobby Inman built. He was National Security Advisor and Director of the CIA, and he will have a big job and appointee as soon as either George Bush or Dukakis are in office. So I'm wondering if Eagle and this Justice Department mayhem will tap then into these major computers that literally can put all kinds of information from all over the world into those locations in Austin, Texas. The Barron article says the INSLAW problems remain magnified by the departure of these, at the time this was written, 6 people. Now there's 10. Where did they go? How high does this go? And starting with HADRON, as Laiti boasted, they were well connected in the administration. And then it goes on to say HADRON is controlled by Dr. Earl Bryan, a long friend of Edwin Meese. Dr. Bryan also owns the Financial News Network, and he also bought up UPI recently and has the United Press International. The business dealings between Edwin Meese family and Dr. Earl Bryan's company almost impaired the Meese nomination in 1984, and they get into that. HADRON, Bill Hamilton charges, is one of the keys to the mystery of why INSLAW became the victim of the rogue Justice Department. HADRON has a history replete with acquisitions. They make their money like vultures eating off of corpses. HADRON takes acquisitions. In this case, the Justice Department was forcing an acquisition so it could gobble up and own the company. And they have lots of government businesses, and they also have had brushes with the Security Exchange Commission. HADRON was born out of the ashes of a company called the Xonics. And I'll do more when I finish the Barron's article to refresh your memory. Xonics had a contract with Edward Teller of Western Goals, that's the massive computer system with John Singlaub and Admiral Thomas Moore and so forth. Xonics was to make Defense Department Star War machinery, and they were in trouble with Helionetics when it was March 23rd, 1983, when Reagan gave his Star Wars speech that Edward Teller wrote, because Teller was part of Xonics and Helionetics, and the stock went up so high that they made hundreds of thousands of dollars in several days. And actually, the company later went bankrupt, Helionetics, because it was being investigated by the Security Exchange Commission. So this is a group of real opportunists surrounding the entire California Alameda Mafia and Ronald Reagan, going back to early days and still profiteering for more expenses. Also on the board of Helionetics was William Simon, whose money from the Olin Foundation went to Albert Hakim, who came from Iran to the West Coast to buy International Imaging System, the Otto von Bolschwing subsidiary. Those are the connections of these people, Xonics to Helionetics, but I'll refresh your memory if you don't know those details later, but the implications here, I think you can see, are pretty high. And the article says Xonics was a notorious high-tech fiasco, Xonics, founded and headed by Bernard Katz, a colorful wheeler and dealer. Barron described Xonics in 1976 as a company with a knack for recognizing income as fast as possible and then deferring their expense as long as possible. In 1977, Security Exchange Commission had a lawsuit against Xonics. It accused them of top management, including Bernard Katz, of fraud, manipulation of stock price, and Xonics was the birthplace and the originator of the company HADRON that took over when the people went under and split and left the name Xonics behind. There were two shareholder suits that followed in 1971. The company didn't admit any wrongdoing. In 1979, Dominic Laiti was asked to form HADRON after a group of former Xonics executives gathered together and decided they changed their name from Xonics to HADRON. And by 1983, this company was lauded by the press as an investment banker's dream. And of course, in 1983, soon Mr. William French Smith would step down, and the great opportunist Edwin Meese would be in the Justice Department, and his friend Earl Brown would be part of HADRON with Mr. Katz, and of course with their power in Washington, it would be an investment banker's dream. HADRON inherited its parent Xonics with an acquisition streak, and it bought 9 companies in 3 years. It would be interesting to know what those 9 companies were that went bankrupt, but they bought them up in 3 years. And there were snags with the Security Exchange Commission in 1981. They ruled that limited partnerships in HADRON had been set up to fund their R&D efforts and were in truth really a form of loan financing, and this is technical, but HADRON at that time lost a $4.5 million lawsuit because of their machinations, and by 1983, Dominic, Laiti, and the group were on a roll, and they went into the laser business. That's where they tie up with Helionetics into the laser business. And then there was a new potential. This was the Star Wars potential, and there's the potential for very, very, very rapid growth, because then they get into the military, and Edward Teller, unbeknownst to the regular Defense Department, had pulled his Star Wars activities with Ronald Reagan, who had been close with since Reagan became governor, and went right away to visit Lawrence Livermore Lab. And then the very people to make the profits out of all of this were companies such as HADRON. In February 1984, HADRON was selling its money-losing laser equipment division, and then it put another $1.2 million into investments that went up and down, and now it is a very successful company. As successful, if you think the way they made their money, it's a little bit scary, but it's described as successful. HADRON was soon getting contracts from Uncle Sam, from the Pentagon. They got a fat settlement from AID, the Agency for International Development, and then they got a gigantic contract for the United States Department of Justice. They were chased all over the place by the Security Exchange Commission and by private lawsuits, but once they were in the government, then nobody touched them, and I guess the Justice Department is its own entity, its own private island, and you can't touch it. Now, Hadron's government contracts could be traced directly to Dr. Earl Bryan, Meese and Lowell Jensen's crony and Reagan's crony, who was the president of Xonics with Katz, the chairman. Bryan was the president of Xonics until October 77, when Xonics was taken over by Dominic Laiti. But Dr. Earl Bryan had been president of Xonics, and he stayed on the board when it was transferred to Hadron. He slipped away from the company for 6 months because there was an injunction against it, but he was never charged with any crimes that as the people in Xonics were charged with. Some of them were seriously penalized. 4 officers were forced to sign a consent decree. They were never charged. Bryan was never charged, but 4 other officers were. But Dr. Earl Bryan and Dominic Laiti of Xonics, who took over Hadron, led the investor group and rescued Hadron from the ruins of Xonics, and then Bryan began to manage this company. Dr. Earl Bryan weaves in and out, and when things are bad, he leaves the company and he isn't named in suits, and when things go good and he gets government contracts, he's up on top, and he made enough money to buy UPI and a lot of other companies. Now, Dominic Laiti, the head of Hadron, is the man who called Bill Hamilton. He's the chairman of Hadron, who was born out of Xonics and the company making the government contracts. And then Dr. Bryan's business developments began to grow, and he controls 4 of the 6 seats on Hadron's board. He's close to Reagan and Meese, of course. And so the company Hadron is controlled by Dr. Earl Bryan, and it was their chairman that wanted to, for Bryan, buy off the computer system that was made by Mr. Hamilton, INSLAW, that he refused to sell. In 1981, Dr. Earl Bryan resigned from Hadron's board to divest himself of Hadron and to facilitate himself for further transactions. And as I say, he was busy buying up liquidated companies, and Bryan was involved in his own business development company called Info Technology, information computer data banks, and also he was interested in Hadron. And by January 1984, 1 year after Hadron's president, Dominic Laiti, had called Bill Hamilton, Earl Bryan was back on the board of Hadron. And I repeat this because this is a company that was born out of Xonics with defense contracts tied up to Star Wars, and Dr. Earl Bryan was up there up through the 1987 annual report with Hadron, and they had sold in October 87 their Atlantic contract services to Infotech. And that information technology is the birth of his buying United Press International, which is a big jump. Dr. Earl Bryan was never in the big bucks like Edwin Meese, but he could come up with big bucks, and he could buy up companies and rescue them and manipulate stocks, and the shareholders weren't sure that anyone in Hadron was making any money but Earl Bryan. Now, starting in 1987, he started to make big money. He got a $1.6 million fee, which seemed big for him because he had bought lots of other companies, from what was AID, and he claimed there was a contract with Syria that didn't go through. And then he went into another business called Acumedics. That's a subsidiary. Now, Acumedics sounds more like medical because he was involved with all these various medical companies that I described several years ago, and so was Ursula Meese. And he bought these medical companies, so when he says Acumedics is a news media affair, I doubt if it's as much a news media as it has to do with medical experiments and medical companies. And when he bought this Acumedics, going way back into the early 70s, it was already a company that was functioning before it became part of Hadron. In those early years, Meese was involved with Ursula Meese in 2 companies that involved not only laser equipment, but biotechnology, one subsidiary, and a company involved with pap tests and cancer smearing and human biological products, and the Food and Drug Administration. And I've run down quite a few times the medical connections of this gentleman and Mrs. Meese and their investments. So Acumedics is a company that was a subsidiary of Hadron, which began to get a $40 million contract with the Justice Department, and that is not very small when they get into a $40 million. the article in Barron said that HADRON was never able to acquire INSLAW, as I've mentioned several times before, and she repeats in the article, but when HADRON Acumetics signed a $40 million deal, this provided automated litigation support services for the Justice Department that involved the Land and Natural Resources Division. So these semi-mini crooks that never really faced the court and on the trail of bankruptcy changed their names and switched boards and so forth, then got a $40 million contract, which is a continuation of a 1983 contract. And this article says that Acumetics started doing business in 1970. Now, the Acumetic title reminds me of the medical business that was started in 1970 when President Richard Nixon, with the help of Henry Kissinger, closed Fort Detrick to the biological and chemical warfare and turned it over to Litton Industries. Litton, a close associate of Meese and Lowell Jensen and Ronald Reagan and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon. And then Litton Industries had the biological genetic unit at Fort Detrick, Maryland. At the same time, when cancer or the disease, the purpose of the Army then was to create a disease that would not respond to the immune system. I'm out of time now on this tape, so I have to stop, and I will continue with Acumetics in 1970 and the implications of Meese and Ursula and all these people in the medical biological field. This is Mae